The string of lights along the back porch railing had been my wife Margaret's idea, back when we first built the deck together in 1987. I kept them up after she passed. Every evening, when the sun dropped behind the tree line and those little warm bulbs flickered on, I'd sit in the same chair and feel like she was still somewhere nearby. My daughter-in-law was standing on that porch the night she said it. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't look around to see if I was close. She said it the way people say things when they've already decided you don't matter enough to be careful around. "He's just going to be a problem," she said to my son. "He's old, he's set in his ways, and honestly, without your mother holding everything together, he doesn't know how to function." He never did. I was standing just inside the screen door with 2 mugs of coffee. I heard every word. I didn't walk out and correct her. I didn't set the mugs down and raise my voice. I went back to the kitchen, poured both cups into the sink, and stood there looking out at the dark backyard until my chest stopped feeling like something had clamped around it. That was the night I understood how the next chapter of my life was going to go. My name is Walter, and I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a master carpenter, the last 18 of them running my own small shop out of a converted barn on our property in Central Virginia. I built furniture, mostly dining tables, bookcases, bed frames, things meant to last. I had a reputation in 3 counties. People drove 2 hours to commission a piece from me. My wife kept the books, handled the clients, answered the phone, and made sure I ate lunch. When she died of a stroke on a Tuesday morning in October, I lost the best business partner I'd ever had and the only person who truly knew me. In that order, though barely. My son Daniel was 41 and living 40 minutes away with his wife Renee and their son, my grandson Cooper, who was 9 at the time. Daniel and I had always been close in the way that quiet men are close. Not a lot of words, but a lot of showing up. He came over every Sunday for years, sometimes with his family, sometimes alone. He'd walk around my shop, pick up pieces I was working on, ask questions he already knew the answers to just to hear me talk. Margaret used to say Daniel came over to remember how to be still. After Margaret died, the Sundays became less frequent. Renee was pleasant enough on the surface, she always had been, but I had noticed, even before that night on the porch, the small ways she managed distance, the way she'd check her phone when I talked, the way she'd redirect Cooper when he asked to stay longer at Grandpa's, the way she referred to my shop as that barn and to my retirement savings as whatever Dad has left over from the old business. I hadn't said anything. Daniel loved her. Cooper adored her. And I was 62, recently widowed, and had no interest in becoming a source of family conflict. But that night changed something. Not in an angry way. Not in a way that made me want to confront anyone or prove anything out of spite. It changed something quieter than that. It reminded me that I had a choice about what the rest of my life looked like, and that I'd been letting other people's assumptions about me make that choice by default. The assumption was clear. I was winding down. Margaret had been the capable one. Without her, I was a lonely old man in a barn full of sawdust who'd eventually need to be managed. I decided to disagree. I'd had an idea for 3 years that I'd never fully pursued. My property sat on 11 acres, 5 of which were wooded and largely unused. For years, people had asked me about taking on apprentices, about teaching, about whether I'd ever consider hosting woodworking workshops. I'd always deferred to Margaret on expansion decisions, and she'd always said, someday had become never. But now I had time, I had the land, and I had a reason that felt different from ambition. It felt like self-definition. I called a contractor I'd worked with for 20 years the first week of November. We walked the property in the cold, both of us breathing steam, and I showed him what I had in mind. A proper workshop building, not a converted barn, but a real structure. Built right, with good light and ventilation and enough space for 12 students at a time. A small classroom attached, a parking area off the main road. Eventually, if things went well, a small overnight lodge for people coming from out of state for weekend intensives. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "You serious, Walt?" I told him I was. He said, "You know what that's going to cost?" I told him I did. I'd spent the previous week going through every account Margaret and I had built together over 30 years. The shop had been profitable for 18 of those years. We'd never been extravagant people. We had land that was paid off. I had Margaret's life insurance. I had what I'd set aside. It was enough to start, and I'd been talking to a small business development center about a loan for the rest. The contractor nodded slowly and said, "All right then, let's do it." I didn't tell Daniel, not because I was hiding anything, but because I had learned something about myself in the weeks since that night on the porch. I worked better without an audience. Margaret had known that about me. She'd always given me room to build before she asked questions. Everyone else, I'd noticed, tended to share opinions before they'd seen anything worth opining about. Renee's voice in my head, "He doesn't know how to function," was actually useful. In a strange way, not as a wound, as a compass. Every morning when I drove out to check on the construction progress, I thought of it, not with bitterness, with something closer to amusement. Construction started in early December and ran through March. I was out there most mornings by 7, not hovering over the crew, but present. I framed walls alongside them when they'd let me. I made the decisions on the details that mattered: the height of the workbenches, the placement of the windows for afternoon light, the species of wood for the demonstration table at the front of the teaching space. I was not a man without function. I was a man who had been briefly without direction, which is a different thing entirely. Cooper came to stay with me for a week during his winter break. He was 10 by then, just old enough to be genuinely curious about how things worked. I let him help me sand a section of benchtop, showed him how to feel the grain with his palm before using a tool. He was patient in the way children sometimes are when they feel respected rather than managed. We ate cereal for dinner one night because neither of us felt like cooking, and he laughed about it all the way to bed. I didn't see Renee's restrictions in him. I saw Margaret's eyes and my stubbornness, and it made me feel like something important was being carried forward. When Daniel dropped Cooper off that first day, he stood at the edge of the construction site and looked at the steel framing going up. He didn't say anything for a minute. Then he said, "Dad, what is this?" I told him. "The workshop school, the plans, the timeline." He was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I said, "I'm telling you now." He looked at me sideways, the way he used to when he was 16, and couldn't tell if I was being stubborn or wise. "Renee thinks you've been struggling," he said carefully. "I know what Renee thinks," I said. He started to say something else, then stopped. He was a good man, my son. He understood when a subject was closed. Spring arrived and the building was finished in April. I spent May fitting out the interior benches. Storage, tool organization, the demonstration table I'd milled myself from a white oak that had come down on the property during a storm 3 years ago. I'd been saving that wood without knowing exactly what it was for. When I set the finished table in place under the skylights and stepped back, I knew I'd been saving it for that exact moment. The first workshop sold out in 6 days. 12 students, a weekend intensive on hand-cut joinery. Most of them drove more than an hour. One couple flew in from Minnesota. I taught for 2 days straight and went to bed Sunday night more tired and more satisfied than I had been in years. By the end of June, I had a waiting list. A profile piece ran in a regional magazine in August, one of those slow travel publications that covers craftspeople and small businesses with old roots. A photographer spent a day at the property. The writer asked me about starting over in my 60s, about grief, about whether building this had been about Margaret or about myself. I told her it was about both, which was true. She asked if there was anyone who doubted I could do it. I smiled and said there had been. The article ran in September. The photograph on the cover was me at the demonstration table, both hands on the white oak surface, looking out the window at the trees. I looked like what I was, an old man in a good place. I didn't send the article to Daniel. I didn't post it anywhere. I let it find its own way, the way things do. It found its way to Renee on a Thursday, through a neighbor who knew a friend who'd seen the magazine. She texted Daniel. Daniel called me. He said, "Dad, you're on the cover of a magazine." His voice had something in it I hadn't heard in a while. Something like awe, maybe, or recognition. I said, "So I heard." He said, "Renee wants to come see the place." I thought about that for a moment. I thought about the screen door and the 2 mugs of coffee I'd poured down the sink. I thought about he doesn't know how to function. I said, "Tell her she's welcome." They came on a Saturday in early October, the 3 of them. Cooper ran ahead of his parents across the gravel drive, already asking questions before he reached the workshop door. Daniel walked with his hands in his pockets, looking up at the roofline, at the sign above the door, modest, just the name of the school in routed letters I'd carved myself. Renee walked a half step behind him. I had coffee on in the small attached office and a piece of Margaret's apple cake that her sister had brought by the week before. I showed them the teaching space first. The light was good that morning, coming in at an angle through the north skylights, catching the dust motes and the grain of the wood surfaces. 12 benches, each with its own tool storage. The white oak demonstration table in the center, the walls lined with reference pieces I'd built over the years. Cooper immediately climbed onto a bench stool and started examining a hand plane I'd left out. Daniel ran his hand along the edge of the demonstration table and said, "This is incredible, Dad. This is genuinely incredible." Renee stood in the middle of the room. She turned slowly, the way people do when they're recalibrating. Her eyes moved from the tools to the skylights, to the milled wood, to the framed certificates on the wall. She had the look of someone doing arithmetic that wasn't coming out the way she expected. She said, "How long did this take?" I said, "Started planning it the week after your last visit, November." A small silence. She knew exactly which visit I meant. I watched her understand that, and I kept my face easy. She said, "I didn't know you were doing any of this." I said, "No, you didn't. Not unkindly, just plainly. The way you state a fact." We walked to the back of the property before lunch. The wooded section, where I'd cleared a trail and was in the early stages of planning the lodge site. The fall leaves were at their peak, all that orange and red against the blue sky, and Cooper ran the trail ahead of us, kicking through the drifts of leaves, the way kids do when they're happy and they can't help it. Daniel walked beside me. After a while, he said quietly, "She shouldn't have said what she said." "I know you heard her." I said, "She said what she believed at the time." He said, "Still." I said, "Daniel, I'm not interested in being right about this. I'm interested in what I built." He nodded. He understood. He was my son, and he had my blood, and he knew the difference between a grievance and a value. Renee was walking ahead of us with Cooper, pointing at something in the canopy. I watched her lift her phone to take a photograph of the trees. I thought about the kind of person she was, not a villain. Exactly. A person who had assessed a situation and reached a conclusion, and who had been wrong. That happens to people. It had happened to me more than once in 63 years. What mattered was not the assessment. What mattered was what I had done with the morning after I heard it. We ate lunch on the shop porch, wrapped in jackets, the late October sun doing what it could, apple cake and bad coffee, and Cooper talking constantly about whether I would teach him to build a box. I told him I'd teach him to build a chair if he wanted, because a chair was harder and he'd learn more. His face lit up like someone had offered him a car. Renee was quieter than usual through lunch. She wasn't cold, she was thoughtful. There's a difference. At one point she looked at me and said, "Do you enjoy it?" Teaching. I mean, not just the building. I told her I did, that I'd been surprised by how much. She said, "I think I underestimated you." She said it evenly, without excessive apology or drama. That was the most I expected, and honestly, it was enough. Maybe more than enough. I said most people do, at first. She half smiled at that. First genuine one of the day. After they left, I sat on the porch in my usual chair as the sun went down and the string lights came on. Cooper had made me promise 3 times about the chair lessons. Daniel had shaken my hand in the driveway in the way that means more than a handshake, that grip that holds on a half-second longer than necessary. Renee had looked back at the workshop building from the car window as they pulled out, and I couldn't read her expression, and I decided I didn't need to. I thought about the night I'd stood at the kitchen sink with 2 poured-out mugs of coffee. I'd had a choice that night. I could have walked through the screen door and set down those mugs and said something sharp that I couldn't take back. I could have let it become a wound I carried around. Something that colored every Sunday dinner and every holiday and every interaction for the next decade. I could have let the label stick old, diminished, non-functional, someone to be managed, because sometimes when a label is applied with enough conviction, it starts to fit. Or I could go to bed, get up the next morning, and build something. I had not built it to show Renee. That's the part that's important to understand. I hadn't spent 11 months pouring my savings and my energy and my grief into that workshop, so I could watch her expression recalibrate on a Saturday in October. If she'd never come, if she'd never seen it, the building would still be standing. The students would still be driving up from 3 states away. Cooper would still be learning to feel the grain of wood with his palm. The doing was not about the proving. The proving, it turned out, was just a side effect of the doing. Margaret would have appreciated that distinction. She'd always been better than me at saying things precisely. She would have sat down in the chair beside mine and found exactly the right sentence for what I was feeling, and it would have been brief and accurate and would have made me laugh. I missed her every day. Some days gently, some days like a weight drop from a height. That evening, it was gentle. More like company than grief. The lights were warm along the railing. The last of the leaves were coming down in the dark, catching the light as they fell. Somewhere in the wooded section, something small was moving through the dry underbrush, unconcerned with anyone's opinions. I had a waiting list for the spring workshops. I had a 10-year-old grandson who wanted to build a chair. I had 11 acres in a structure I'd raised from bare ground. And I had the particular satisfaction of a man who answered a dismissal, not with argument, but with action. Renee had called me underestimated. I thought the more accurate word was quiet. There is a kind of man who responds to doubt by talking louder. I had never been that man. I had always been the man who walked back to the shop, picked up the tool, and let the finished thing speak for itself. At 63, I was too old to change that, and too satisfied with the results to want to. The lights stayed on until midnight. They always did. I left them on for Margaret.